The Fed was created in 1913. One of the first things it did was to print up enough money so that we could enter World War I.
Central banking is Marxist. Like, it's literally in the 1848 manifesto to the Communist Party.
Woodrow Wilson paid the Tsar to participate in World War I. And Lenin himself once said, the war made our party.
I've come to believe that the corruption of money is the corruption of the soul of the human race. It's a very strong material incentive.
It's not just the pursuit of money, but money and power, lust to dominate politically.
Specifically power over other people.
So it struck me that, well, gee, maybe the story that I was taught in public school, that God sent Abraham Lincoln to earth to free the slaves, is not the entire truth.
So he squashed freedom of speech, counterfeited currency, attacked his own countrymen.
As bad as Keynesian economics is, theoretically, in practice, it's just all over the place. The politicians will do what they think is good for them, not what's good for the country.
If someone just gives you money and you didn't earn it, easy come, easy go, right? It's much easy to spend that money foolishly.
The Fed is kind of like an arsonist who sets fires, and then once the fire gets going, he changes clothes into a firefighter's uniform and pretends to be putting out the fire by putting more gasoline on it.
I don't know how people get tricked or hypnotized into believing that the state is their friend. I'm like, open a history book and show me. Like, what have you got?
So we've abolished 3 central banks in our history, and so why can't we do it again?
So you've been an economist for many years. You're currently, correct me if I'm wrong, the president of the Mises Institute.
That's right.
That's right. Mises, someone we near and dear to the heart of this show. We talk about him and his work probably every episode. I think I quote him. I've read Human Action twice. I think it's one of the most profound books ever written. Very difficult to read. His English is very Germanic, but his points are, that guy is something else.
Yeah,
right?
very brilliant. Yeah,
brilliant human, truly. Let's just start with a little bit about you. Like, how did you get on this Austrian economic path? How did you come to be the president of the Mises Institute? What brings you into this world?
Okay, well, I was an economics major as an undergraduate in school. And my first year in college, and I walked into the classroom of Econ 101, and there was a bookshelf with a bunch of books, and it was The Freeman, a magazine published by the Foundation of Economic Education. And it had all these articles by Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and all this sort of free market economics. And I thought it was great. I loved the logic of it, and it was relevant to things in today's world, and these men were all really good writers, and that's how that got me interested in economics in general. And then I had a professor who was a Chicago school economist, and they were known as free market economists back then, and he sort of guided me along. And I went to graduate school, and one of my professors was James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in 1986. And he was a fellow traveler of the Austrian school. In the very first semester of microeconomics in graduate school, the professor used Human Action as a textbook.
Nice.
And he used Milton Friedman's textbook called Price Theory. Okay. That was the book that was used at Chicago during that time.
Got it.
And so my microeconomics professor was an Austrian named Richard Wagner. And the thing that struck me about the Austrians is I'm reading all the mainstream economic literature while in graduate school. Yeah. And the emphasis was always seemed to be to impress other economists at how much of a clever mathematical model builder you are. Whereas when I read Mises and the other Austrians, and these are people who had this compulsion to understand how the world works. Right. And they educated themselves. And Mises, you read his books, they're filled with philosophy, political philosophy, history, very interdisciplinary. And he's a real scholar. Whereas the mainstream, I'm taking all these courses and they're all very math-oriented, and they're all about model building. Yeah. And the end was the model. It wasn't, even if the model had nothing to do with reality, it was the model. Yes. And so, and that's what really got me interested in thinking, well, this is what I want to do. This is the way I want to go. If I'm going to earn a PhD degree in economics, I don't want to. I'd rather park cars. I remember telling myself than do this the mainstream way for a career as an academic. And so that's sort of what got me into it. And I enjoy the writing. Buchanan was a great writer. He graduated from Middle Tennessee State with degrees in English, economics, and math. He's a brilliant man. He won the Nobel Prize. And Friedman was the same thing. Not quite as many degrees. But he had a little book that I still have. It was called An Economist's Protest. And Friedman had a Newsweek magazine column every other week. Paul Samuelson, the Keynesian, would have one week, then the next week would be Milton Friedman. And Friedman put all of his essays into a book. And they're all 3 or 4 page essays that were very logical, and he would marshal facts to make his point. And that impressed me that would be fun way to be able to do that someday.
Yeah.
And you could have an influence on the world because you're speaking to real people.
For sure.
You're not just other academics. Yeah. Whereas most academics, they're only concerned with talking to other academics.
Yes.
And after 40 years in the business, that's pretty much what I observed.
Yeah, the echo chamber is an ever-present danger, right? Especially when you get heavy in the jargon and whatnot. The academics just start talking to the other academics, and then it's like, what's the point? You're supposed to be advancing human knowledge, and if you're just talking amongst yourselves, well, then that's not very useful for the rest of us. Yeah, and there are gatekeepers. The thing about there's also gatekeepers in every discipline. And these are the people who are the editors of the bigger journals. And they have a point of view. They have a publication record of themselves, which is how they got to be editor of a prestigious journal. And they don't want, not always, but they seldom want people to criticize their point of view. And I'll give you one example, personal example, is one of my articles that was eventually published, and this is way back in around 1984 or 85, I challenged the standard story about the first antitrust law in America, the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so the standard story says that there was rampant monopolization in the 1880s during the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, there was price deflation for decades. And just that got me thinking, well, how can this be? How can this be the whole economy is becoming monopoly, run by monopolies, but prices keep going down for decades? And so I smelled a rat, and I published a paper called The Origins of Antitrust, and where I showed that the people who wanted the first antitrust laws were basically the industries who could not or would not match the price cuts of Rockefeller and the other people who were. Rockefeller became so wealthy by reducing the price of refined kerosene by many orders of magnitude for 30 or 40 years. That's how Standard Oil became so rich, and so anyway, I published this article, but I had sent it to a University of Chicago article. And George Stigler, who was another Nobel Prize winner who was on the faculty at Chicago at the time, he was known as being a supporter of the mainstream idea that we needed a Sherman Antitrust Act to fight monopoly. And my paper said, no, this is creating less competition, not more competition. And the editor of the journal, who's a nice guy, I won't mention his name, he wrote me a letter and he says, we don't criticize Nobel Prize winners here. So there was no substantive discussion at all of the article. It was just, I'm the gatekeeper. He probably was worried he would get fired as his job as the editor of the journal if he published an article that criticized George Stigler. Yeah, that's a great instance of human corruption, right? Where someone's career risk all of a sudden starts to suppress dialogue and open discussion, right?
We have there's some of that, of course, but there's also people think of the academic world, the academic freedom, and all that, but it's not as free as it has always been made out to be as far as that goes. And then you got the issue of government funding of so much research. And Paul Craig Roberts, who's been one of my favorite columnists for decades, he pointed out in one of his columns that physics research, anybody who maybe took a physics class or two in school and liked it and knows a little bit about it, got to realize that most of the physics research in universities is funded by the Defense Department,
Right.
and it's military related physics, and he argues, Paul Craig Roberts argues that that's true of pretty much every academic discipline. So overwhelmingly funded by government. That's why, by the way, these think tanks, the Cato Institute, the Mises Institute is not a think tank. We're an education, economic education and research organization. We don't produce pamphlets on the latest bill before Congress. That's what the so-called think tanks do day to day. We take a longer-term view of educating everybody we can reach. But that's why they came into existence, is that there were a lot of philanthropists and business people who understood this, that there was a need for an alternative view. For example, the former CEO of BB&T Bank, John Allison is his name. He calls me up on the phone one day out of the blue, never met the guy, and he said, "I read your book. I have a book called How Capitalism Saved America." And the subtitle is The Untold History of Our Country from the Pilgrims to the Present. He tells me I had all my senior managers at BB&T read the book, and he offered me a grant of $350,000 over 7 years for an academic program on what he called moral foundations of capitalism. And so there are people like that, and he did this in other universities, other scholars around the world, around the country rather, and it's just because he liked my book, and so he'll find, and so that introduced a greater degree of academic freedom than all the talk about academic freedom. But my university president hated this. He's a big left-wing, a big socialist, and they gave me a hard time over it. It took him 2 months to give me permission to accept the grant, even though this is a Fortune 500 CEO offering me $250,000. And they didn't want to even have a press release to announce it. And I was teaching in a business school. You'd think they would think a business school professor who got this kind of offer would be that the alumni would like this and send more contributions, but they were so embarrassed that I would be maybe having a debate over the moral implications of capitalism. And they didn't want to allow that to happen.
So let's talk about that. Capitalism has been so thoroughly demonized, right? Specifically largely by the left. We were just talking offline how first of all, how is that even possible, right? We have central planning in money. If money's 1/2 of every transaction, then you cannot be any more than 1/2 capitalist. Even if you're the perfect capitalist economy, if you've got a central bank, you're 50% capitalist, 50% Marxist, basically. I mean, central banking is Marxist. Like it's literally in the 1848 manifesto to the Communist Party. How, and this is something I think about a lot, is how pernicious the problem of money printing is, right? That the central bank prints money, it uses the purchasing power stolen to then fund these academic organizations. Even the pseudoscience of Keynesian economics itself, I would argue, is funded by this mechanism of theft. So then the institution that steals from people then creates, fake news, propaganda, and even academic justification for continued inflation, for continued monopolization and management of the money supply. And then people start to believe it over time, right? People that are outside of Bitcoin still think, maybe not now, but pre-pandemic, they thought inflation is just like a normal thing. Now people are starting to wake up to it a little bit because the internet and the pain is more extensive. But how do you think about that problem? It's like if you can print money and steal from people and then use those stolen proceeds to convince them that it's good for them, you get in this very vicious cycle. What am I right in that assessment? And if so, what can we do about that?
It's an ingredient of totalitarianism. We talked earlier about how a book project I'm working on is the Revolution of 1913, when the year we got the Fed, and also the income tax and the direct election of senators. And but it was all part of the so-called progressive era. And you're right. It's in the Communist Manifesto. Government control of the money is one of the top points in
measure number 5,
planks.
as I recall.
So the totalitarian communists always understood, control of money and control of capital is what's necessary to have totalitarian communism. And the Fed, one of the things that people don't realize either is that in addition to being a legalized counterfeiter, the Fed regulates almost every financial transaction imaginable. There are dozens and dozens of subdivisions of the Fed related to every aspect of banking, overseas banking, branch banking, anything has to do with money. The Fed is regulating it. It's not just printing money,
right?
And that makes it a much more central planning agency than what you even described just now. And years ago, I was at a conference in Washington D.C. sponsored by the Cato Institute, and it happened to be on antitrust regulation. And I quoted Alan Greenspan. He wrote this big article in one of Ayn Rand's books in 1960.
Oh, I remember that.
Saying that antitrust ought to be abolished. And I quoted him saying that. And then I made a sort of a snide remark, and I said, well, this was a long time ago. It was 1960, before Greenspan became a central planner. And half the crowd kind of laughed, and the other half had very somber looks on their faces because this was the Washington, D.C. audience. And even though a lot of them were conservatives or libertarians, they were pro-Fed because they wanted to be accepted as part of the establishment, even the Cato Institute people. And that's probably what got me kicked off the list of academic adjuncts of the Cato Institute. I was one of the first ones to be an adjunct scholar of the Cato Institute. And then shortly after that, they said, we don't need your services anymore. And because they had, when Greenspan got married to Andrea Mitchell, the Cato Institute actually put on a big wedding party for them, the reception, and I was there, and so they were really in with the Fed, and I'm kind of a big storyteller, but I had dinner once at another conference. I sat with Milton Friedman and Ed Crane, the former president of the Cato Institute. And before the Cato Institute, or the Cato, I think, was about to build their building in Washington, D.C., and Friedman was trying to talk Ed Crane out of it. He's saying, you moved to D.C. from California, you're going to be corrupted. You will inevitably be corrupted by the establishment because you'll want to be part of the establishment, and they will corrupt you. You won't corrupt them. Their ideas will infect you. Your ideas are not going to infect them. And he was right. Friedman was right at the time. And my personal example is an early example of this, is that don't criticize the Fed too much. Right. And Cato had a monetary conference every year, big conference in D.C. And for 25 years, they never invited Ron Paul, the most famous libertarian critic of the Fed. But then once Ron became super famous running for president, they finally invited him after 20 years. But in the meantime, they had hundreds of Fed bureaucrats at their conference over the years, over 25 years. And they always proudly boasted vice president of this, vice president of that, of the Federal Reserve Board. And that's who spoke at their conferences. Wow. And so the Fed is more insidious than people know because of it. It really is a central planning agency.
Yeah.
And the government, and it gives the government the ability to tell us we can get something for nothing.
Right.
And the Fed was created in 1913. One of the first things it did was to print up enough money so that we could enter World War I. I doubt that we could have entered World War I, participated in World War I without the Fed. Exactly. And what a calamity that was. It had nothing whatsoever to do with us in this country. And it led to Stalin taking over Russia, Hitler later on. The Bolsheviks were an anti-war party during World War I. Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States at the time, paid the Russian government, the Tsar, to participate in World War I. 400,000 Russians died in World War I. And the Bolshevik Party was the only anti-war party. And Lenin himself once said, the war made our party. Because that's how the Bolsheviks, the communists, took over Russia. And it was Woodrow Wilson paying them. And the Fed, you can make a connection. The Fed allowed him to do, since before that, who ever heard of the president of the United States giving a foreign government hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to do anything.
Right.
But with the Fed, it's, they just print it up and it's legalized counterfeiting.
I'm reminded of, I think it was Ron Paul actually. He said foreign aid is taking money from poor people in a rich country and giving it to rich people in a poor country.
Yeah, because taxpayers, the maid that comes into the office building at night at my former university and to clean up, she's a taxpayer.
Exactly.
And she doesn't pay much tax, but she pays some tax.
Right.
And that's, and we're sending some of that to who knows what.
Well, not only the tax, but also the inflation, right?
Yeah.
The people that are the people that are depending on dollars the most to hold purchasing power across time are those being disproportionately predated upon by the inflationary counterfeiting system, right? So you're literally stealing money from poor people and middle class in the U.S. and shifting it to rich people in Russia, in this case, to wage war.
Yeah. The usual way, what usually happens with so-called foreign aid is that a lot of it is in form of, we'll send grain or some kind of food or tractors. So it's the American corporations, the farm agriculture, the corporate farms that make all the money. It's International Harvester that gets paid to sell more tractors courtesy of the taxpayers. And so it's not so much the people in these countries; it's the rich American corporations that makes the so-called foreign aid money. It's not so foreign,
right.
They throw a few crumbs to the people in these countries, but the big chunks of pie go to the American corporations with so-called foreign aid.
Of course.
Yeah.
In Bitcoin, we often dream about the idea of forming citadels, which are independent, self-sovereign communities that have their own energy, food, and water resources. Today, that dream is becoming a reality at the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a 705-acre regenerative agriculture community located at the Florida-Georgia line near Folkston, Georgia. The farm is known as the healthiest place on earth, and it includes orchards, organic standing gardens, regenerative animal pastures, berry fields, and much, much more. Today, the farm features 25 custom-built cabins and has plans to construct 225 more in the years ahead. The farm has its own food, energy, and water sources and is completely off-grid. So if you're looking to join a Citadel community comprised of sovereign individuals, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about membership. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on custom cabin pricing. Again, that's okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. iCoin Technology has released a slick new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a high-res 3-inch touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, and no GPS. It is an air-gapped hardware wallet which uses QR codes and a camera to communicate with the Bitcoin network. It has a built-in camera which is required for air-gap operation, and it has an optional Bluetooth compatibility. It's really a brand new user interface and user experience for a Bitcoin hardware wallet. iCoin makes self-custody accessible, easy to use, and non-intimidating. It even comes with an optional custom iCoin thermal printer, so you can print out the private key and its associated QR code when you're setting up the wallet. This makes setup quick and simple. Also, it is easy to restore the wallet just by reading the seed phrase QR code with the wallet camera. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like the iCoin wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. So go to iCointechnology.com/breedlove today for 30% off the purchase of this sleek new hardware wallet. Again, that's iCointechnology.com/breedlove. I want to go back to this topic of corruption you were mentioning. You brought up Alan Greenspan, for instance, right? Like he became chairman of the Federal Reserve and became a major central planner and advocate for central banking and all these things. But before that, he had written a lot of very interesting things. You alluded to one of them. There was also the piece he wrote that said something to the effect that private gold ownership would have to be made illegal for a welfare warfare state to operate, because if people had access to a superior store value, then they would dump the fiat to buy the gold, basically, and the welfare warfare state couldn't function.
Competing currency,
Exactly. So he was like kind of an anarcho-capitalist in his upbringing, or his uprising, I guess. But then when he became chairman, he ascended to the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he was a full-blown central planner. So, how I want to talk about like the corruption of money leading to the corruption of man, right? Like here's this really smart guy that sees the value of free market economics, but by the end of his career, he's become a proverbial Darth Vader kind of situation. You mentioned Milton Friedman earlier before we hit record, that he kind of did the opposite in a way, that maybe he had more establishment views early on, and then when he was retired and free from that, he became more libertarian in his views. So could you just, think out loud or talk about this interrelationship between the corruption of money? When I say that, I mean like the monopolization of money under the paradigm of central banking, and how it corrupts people individually and changes their views over time.
There's an article somewhere on our website, Mises.org, comparing Alan Greenspan's career to Murray Rothbard's career. Greenspan, in 1960, Alan Greenspan and Murray Rothbard could have been roommates, and ideological roommates. Anyway, and Greenspan wrote another article. I think it was in Ayn Rand's book, Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal. He had an article on the gold standard, and we mentioned Ron Paul. And by the way, when Ron was in Congress, he was on the House Banking Committee, and Greenspan came to give a presentation. And Ron brought a copy of that article, his Greenspan's article from 1960 on the gold standard, and he asked Alan Greenspan if he could autograph it, which he did. And he said, "Do you still believe this?" And Greenspan said, "Yes." And so that's pretty condemning, because he was the chairman of the Fed. And I know that's the truth, but I want a career. I want a political career, so I need to ignore the truth. And so the story of Greenspan made a decision. He wanted to be an establishment Republican economist, well-connected, because he knew a lot of good things can happen. It's good for your business. You get a lot of additional business from politically connected people. You get the prestige of being appointed to government commissions and eventually Fed chairman. And then you compare that to Murray Rothbard, who stood fast in believing in the same things that he and Greenspan both believed in when they were younger, and pretty much anarcho-libertarianism. And he taught at a small college place called, Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, I think it was. It was an engineering school, and they taught a few economics courses. And so Murray is a native of Brooklyn, so he had that job. Didn't pay very well, didn't live very well, until a donor, a wealthy entrepreneur from Las Vegas, thought that Murray was being underappreciated, and he got him an endowed chair at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, for the last, 10 or 12 years of his academic career out there. And so Murray sort of toiled in obscurity. He wrote all these great books. He wrote A Man, Economy, and State when I think he was, barely 30 years old.
Wow.
Which is a treatise, giant treatise in all of economics. And that's and a lot of other great books. And
Man, Economy, State, Power and Markets.
Yeah,
right?
and Power and Markets is a great book. We have an archives at the Mises Institute with all of Murray's, everything he ever wrote on a typewriter. And so we even have the typewriter also. And it's fascinating to see letters. They have correspondence with Ludwig von Mises and Hayek and people like that. We have all of that in our archives at the Mises Institute building. And so, and Murray toiled like that. We even have a video. I don't know who took this video. I forget what election it was. I think it was 1972. Murray Rothbard in a bus in New York City, and some TV guy shows up with a camera crew, and he asks him, "Who are you voting for, sir?" And he says, "Nobody. I never vote." It only encourages them, he says. And we have the video that
a man after my own heart
that we show people. But that's how the money, the opportunities to be a part of the power structure are greatly expanded by the government's ability to print money like that.
Yes.
You know, the original system was you run for Congress and you serve in Congress for 2 or 3 terms, then you go back home. And because the founding fathers understood that it's important for members of Congress to go back and live like the rest of us. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they'll exempt themselves from the laws and the taxes and everything that the rest of us have to live under, which they do. Yeah. And that was the original system. But you know, as Jefferson once said, the natural tendency of things is for liberty to decline and government to gain ground, or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And he said that, you know, the Constitution was probably 5 years old when he said that, right? Because he was a student of the Roman Empire and government throughout history, and they knew what government is government. It's not going to change. It's no different. When I was in school, I remember in college, I did a report for a history class on politics in the Roman Empire. And I remember thinking at the time it sounded just like the Nixon administration. Uh-huh. At the time, some things never change with politics.
Yeah, like I'll paraphrase this. It just came to mind as you were saying that, but that periodically the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of tyrants and revolutionaries.
Patriots and tyrants.
Patriots and tyrants. Yeah, and it's unfortunate, right? It's like, why do we keep having to do that over and over? Like, we've discovered these principles. Yeah. We've seen there's like basically airtight theoretical justification or grounding for these ideas, right? So, like, you know, like Mises's axiom of action, and, you know, you mentioned Man, Economy, and State, which is basically Rothbard's, as you said, more readable, accessible version of human action. And there's very strong theoretical footing for these principles and ideas. There's also a lot of historical and empirical evidence, right? Where we've seen places that had low to no taxes or strong rule of law, you see them flourish economically. Why do we keep having to destroy ourselves over and over? Like, it just, like, the ideas don't seem to stick. I'm reminded of that one saying that the one thing we can learn from history is that we don't learn from history. Why is that the case? Yeah.
Well, there's always a remnant. You know, Ludwig von Mises wrote in Human Action that even during his time, we were talking about the 1940s, that he said the universities of his day, he called them nurseries of socialism, because they were mostly government funded in his day.
That has not
changed.
And
you couldn't expect a government funded institution to not be biased in favor of government and hypercritical of the civil society and private enterprise and freedom in general. Right. And that just festers on itself as well. So even in his day, he knew that. But he also said there's always been sort of a remnant of young people, college students, he said, who don't buy it. Yeah. They're more interested in the truth. Right. And that's who we at the Mises Institute are mostly trying to reach and educate is the younger people. We even have a beginners series now of videos, sort of introductory videos for kids. Okay. It's only about a year old, and we have 11.5 million views on the internet of it. A short video. You know, what is capitalism? What is money? What is progressivism? Is one of them. Yeah. And so we're trying to start them young. Yeah. But most of the students we work with are undergraduate and graduate students. Yeah. And but we're also sort of branching out. We have a textbook now, sort of economics for the young economists that, you know, high school kids can learn a lot of basic economics from. And last year, we had a donor give us enough money to give away 100,000 copies of Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, famous book. And we gave away every last one of them. Wow! And we got another donor this year who gave us money to give away this book, What Has Government Done to Our Money, by Murray Rothbard. Yeah. And as of today, we've given away 80,000 of those. 20 more thousand to go to give away.
That's the first book I gave my nephew for his homeschooling assignment. Was What Has Government Done to Our Money?
Yeah, it's a great book. It's online too. You don't need to buy the book, or we will give you one for free. We still have 20,000 giveaways left. If anyone listening to your podcast wants a free book, go on Mises.org and you scroll down to the bottom and we'll sign up.
Amazing. Yeah. So there's I won't try to attribute the quote. The line between good and evil cuts down the heart of every man, as has been said. It sounds like there's kind of this, the visual I had was like the moths to the flame, right? That the Greenspan saw the power and the money that was available if he just deviated from the truth, right? The truth that not only did he know, like he wrote about at length. And so that is corruption, right? When you decide to lay down the truth, this is what philosophy is, right? The love of wisdom or the pursuit of truth. Yeah. And you start instead engaging in sophistry as a professional sophist, basically. And in a way, it's like, all right, so Greenspan in his life enjoys so much more financial success than a guy like Rothbard that remains a philosopher, right? Greenspan becomes the sophist, Rothbard remains the philosopher. But posthumously, I would say that Rothbard is way more successful than Greenspan, right? His ideas and his books, so he's a legend.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, he is. We have our website, Mises.org. We have a lot of, you can get a great free education. You can download all of Rothbard's books, including Man, Economy, and State. Yeah. And Man, Economy, and State downloads on our website 30 to 40,000 times a month, every month, year in and year out, as does Human Action. Amazing. Human Action by 30, 40, sometimes 50,000 a month downloads from all over the world of these books. Whereas Alan Greenspan, who wants to read anything by Alan Greenspan? Yes. Yes. When he was Fed chairman, I used to show videos to my classes of his statements, and I would say, pay close attention because nothing makes sense. He would show up in front of Congress, and on purpose, I'm sure, he would say nothing that would roil the stock market. And it would all be gibberish. It'd all be, he would say it in a very boring tone. He's a very boring sounding guy. And you see these politicians, they're all puzzled looks on their faces, like, what in the world is he talking about? Yeah. And I was always convinced that he did that on purpose because he didn't want to cause the stock market to go crash or to balloon up and then crash or anything. Right. And it was all an act.
This reminds me of the difference between real art and propaganda. Yeah. Right? That propaganda can sort of in the short run, in the moment, be motivating and influential on people, but it never stands the test of time. Yeah. Right? You never see propaganda hanging in an art gallery. Yeah. I mean, other than to display it as propaganda. But real art stands the test of time, right? We appreciate it for generation after generation. Yeah. And so what Rothbard was doing was creating art, right? Yeah. He's like actually pursuing truth, putting it into writing, furthering our understanding of economics. Whereas a guy like Greenspan is really just furthering his own self-interest, right? And propaganda, his whole life becomes an act, as you said, just this propagandistic bullshit.
That's right.
And so you're like,
well, that's Washington, D.C. That's a good definition of all of Washington, isn't it?
Right. And so we use this metaphor sometimes of like selling your soul, but like there's some truth to it, right? Like you can actually, the time being the judge of all things, it will show the truth eventually. And I think this is a great little vignette of how comparing Rothbard and Greenspan, they went from ideological roommates. They chose distinctly different paths in life. One chose to be the hero, one chose to be the villain. Yeah. And you get all the trappings, I guess, during your life. And if that's what you want to do, great. But you're really going to find fulfillment in living life beyond yourself. And that's what Rothbard did, right? He added to the repository of human knowledge. And
I knew Murray Rothbard personally. I taught at Mises University, our summer school, with him for several years, and he was a happy person. Yeah, he would be surrounded by all these students. It was like Jesus and his disciples at our conferences, and he was always smiling. He would stay up until 3 or 4 in the morning talking, and they'd have a keg of beer out there outside the institute or wherever the event was, and the kids would stay up until sun came up if he didn't go to bed. Wow. And he was just loved every minute of that, even though he was in a position that he'd been discriminated against his whole life. Right. From beginning in school. His dissertation advisor in Columbia was Arthur Burns, who's another Fed chairman. Right. And Murray's doctoral dissertation was called The Panic of 1819. It was the very first big depression in America. And so the Bank of the United States was activated in 1817, precursor of the Fed.
What a coincidence.
And so it created a bubble. The bubble burst and created the Panic of 1819. And Arthur Burns gave him a very hard time. He probably extended his time finishing for a year or two in that. And so Murray had a huge titanic struggle, maybe more than 2 or 3 years, because of Arthur Burns, and he finally graduated, but it was too anti-establishmentarian, even though it was the truth about what caused You think even if it wasn't 100% convincing, social science is social science. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
And so you can't prove anything with statistics. You can talk about probabilities with statistics.
Sure.
The field of statistics.
Yeah.
And so, there are a lot of doctoral dissertations at Columbia that didn't prove anything, but they made a compelling argument enough for the student to pass the exam, the oral exam and get his PhD degree. But they gave Murray Rothbard an extra hard time over that. And you would think, okay, the Bank of the United States was created in 1817. It inflates the money supply. There's a crash. Why is that not a feasible thing to think of?
Of course.
But it was too critical of the Fed. And Arthur Burns wanted to be the chairman of the Fed, which he eventually was.
Yeah.
And so that's another example of great corruption.
Right.
Arthur Burns.
Yeah, corrupt money corrupting the soul. Yeah. This honestly, it's something we keep exploring from different angles on this show. But I've come to believe that like the corruption of money is the corruption of the soul of the human race to some extent. Like obviously not everyone, right? People can resist it.
Yeah.
But it's a very strong material incentive, and it pushes people like Greenspan that could have been a real asset to the human race into this dark path. And so that's where Bitcoin becomes very celebrated in Bitcoiners' view, right? It's like maybe we have a money that people can't corrupt for once, and that could be a really good thing for our souls.
Yeah, well, it's not attached to government. I mean, the greenback dollar, the pursuit of that is not. I think it's not just the pursuit of money, but money and power.
Yes,
people like Greenspan and
specifically
the others,
power over other people.
Judge Napolitano used to be on the Fox News channel, and now he has his own podcast. I think he's on Newsmax television also these days. He gave a speech once at the Mises Institute, and he throws out this phrase, libido dominandi. And somebody in the audience said, "Oh, I read that book. It's about sexual dominance," but he meant lust to dominate politically. It's the same word.
Yeah.
And so he said, there's some percentage of every society where there are people that have this lust to dominate other people.
Sure.
And in one of my articles on the web, I mentioned that. And then I have an old friend named Clyde Wilson, who was a history professor at University of South Carolina for many years. And he wrote an article once, and he's written a lot about the Civil War. And he wrote an article called "The Yankee Problem in America." The Civil War, the Yankees. And so it wasn't Northerners, people from the North who were Yankees. They were like the descendants of Puritans. He says there are a lot of righteous, good people in the North who are not Yankees.
Right.
And Clyde says Hillary Clinton, for example, would be, he called a museum-quality specimen of a Yankee, entitled, domineering, he had wanting to dictate to other people, and that's a Yankee.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing that the libido dominandi of, I guess it sounds more Italian in Napolitano's Italian, but he uses that line. But they're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
And so you'd put the Greenspan and these people in that category. They just lust for power, even if they call themselves conservatives. But they want to have power to impose on their point of view.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. There's the Nietzschean kind of will to power, which is maybe okay if it's within the sphere of consent, but then when you get beyond it and you try to start imposing your will on other people, that's when things you get that libido dominante. Is that what you said? Yeah.
I think it's ANDE at the end. I think at the end is dominante.
Yeah, and hopefully, I guess that's kind of the value prop of Bitcoin, is that it makes you indomitable, right? At least from a monetary standpoint, at least, and allows you to vote with your feet more effectively and things like that.
Yeah, you don't have to be a sycophant to Bitcoin traders,
right?
to use Bitcoin,
exactly.
But you have to be a Fed worshiper,
right?
To be to progress in politics anyway, at the federal level.
Yes.
And when Ron Paul. When the Republicans took over Congress, in the first Trump era, and Ron Paul became the chairman of the House Banking Committee, I was his first witness, and there were several of the Democrats on the committee. All they tried to do was all ad hominem and personal attacks on me. They found out that I wrote a book criticizing Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to associate with me with the Ku Klux Klan or something. It just all smear jobs.
Yeah.
And then after that was over with, I went home and looked up the Federal Election Commission statistics on who donates to who.
Yeah.
And the guy who did most of this, his name was Clay. He's out of Congress now. His top 10 donors were all banks. Every one of them, all banks.
Yes.
And so they knew Ron, Ron was the chairman of the committee. They knew he invited two witnesses, me and Richard Vedder, and so they were ready to go in for the kill.
Yes.
On that.
Yeah. Again, continually reminded that no man is better than his incentives.
Yeah.
And you see it time and time and time again.
Yeah, it's been very entertaining the last couple of days when Elon Musk said it would be a great idea to appoint Ron Paul as chairman of the Fed.
Yeah, I saw that. I sincerely hope that happens, and I sincerely hope they finally audit the Fed.
Yeah, of course.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE.
Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. You brought up your book on Abraham Lincoln. So, I mean, can we just talk a little bit about that? Like, how does your view of Abraham Lincoln and his presidency deviate from the widely held notion of Abraham Lincoln as old Honest Abe?
Most Americans are taught in school that he's the best president ever. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I remember being taught in Pennsylvania public school that Lincoln was so honest that he once walked 6 miles to return a penny to a merchant who had undercharged him, and then 6 miles back home. I forget whether they said it was uphill both ways, but that was the story. And even in elementary school, I thought, well, this sounds kind of fishy. Who would do that for a penny? Right. He couldn't wait till the next time he went to that place to buy candy or whatever. Yeah. Because I was thinking, that's what I would do. Next time my dad took the horse and buggy to this place, I'd bring an extra penny. Yeah. But anyway. In my academic career, I had a hobby, was Civil War history. I read dozens of books about all the battles and the generals. I took courses at the Smithsonian Institution, went on battlefield tours. They were just a hobby. Yeah. And I got to wondering, how can I combine my hobby with my profession of economics? And that would mean, well, what did Lincoln have to say about economic policy? Every president is all about money and power. Mm-hmm. But the one president in American history that was all about humanitarianism and nothing but humanitarianism was Abe Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And as a libertarian, I knew that was a big bunch of BS. Mm-hmm. Had to be. It's and the war had nothing to do with money and power. So I began just reading about well, what did he believe in as far as economics? And it turns out that from when he first announced he was going to run for office in Illinois, he said, the reason I'm getting into politics are 3 things. We need a national bank, which is a central bank. We need what we today call corporate welfare for the railroad corporations. He was a lawyer for the Illinois Central General Counsel for the Illinois Central Railroad eventually. And we need protectionist tariffs to protect American manufacturers from competition. That's why I'm into politics. And that was the Whig Party agenda. And Lincoln was a Whig for some 20 years before, more than 20 years before becoming a Republican, because the Whig Party disappeared, it dissolved. And so for 20 some years, he did nothing but advocate those things in politics. By his own admission, he never even mentioned the word slavery until 1855. And so there you have it. You have what he was about. He got the nomination because the Pennsylvania delegation put him over the top, and because he had gone to all of the steel manufacturers in Pennsylvania, Thaddeus Stevens and people like that, and showed him all his past speeches advocating protectionist tariffs on steel, with 25 years worth. And he convinced them he was their guy for protectionism. That's how I got the nomination, and that's how I became president. The Northern industrial banking elite put him in. And so it struck me that, well, gee, maybe the story that I was taught in public school, that God sent Abraham Lincoln to earth to free the slaves, is not the entire truth. And so one of the chapters of my book, The Real Lincoln, is called Lincoln's Real Agenda. But you don't have to read my book. You could read Lincoln's first inaugural address. The first part of it, I call it his Slavery Forever speech, where he says, I have no intention to disturb slavery. You can read all of my past speeches. They say the same thing. He says, the Republican platform of 1860s says that. We do not intend to disturb slavery. And even if I did, it would be unconstitutional to do so. Then he said, I support the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a law passed in 1850 that forced Northerners to capture runaway slaves. And they paid magistrates $10 if they decided to return them to their owners, $5 if they freed them, and they didn't free anybody. You don't have to have a degree in economics to understand the incentive that they wanted to create there. So he supports that. Then at the end of the speech, he supports something called the Corwin Amendment to the Constitution, named after an Ohio congressman named Thomas Corwin. But it was actually the work of Lincoln himself, and I'll explain that. And this Corwin Amendment would have prohibited the federal government from ever interfering in slavery. And so it would have enshrined slavery in the text of the Constitution.
Wow.
It had already passed the House and the Senate, and this is after the Deep South seceded. So the Republican Party controlled the House and the Senate, and they passed the Corwin Amendment, as did 5 states, including Illinois, Rhode Island, and Ohio, northern states, and Oregon, eventually did. And so the land of Lincoln endorsed this. So Lincoln lies about this in his first inaugural address near the end. He says, I haven't seen this amendment, but it came from him. They just put Thomas Corwin's name on it. And he says, I think slavery is constitutional, but I have no objection to making it express and irrevocable. Those are his words, express and irrevocable, right in the text of the Constitution. So he gave the South an ironclad protection, the biggest protection of slavery ever mentioned by an American politician. And he announces this to the world. The world was listening to this, not just the people in Washington, D.C. gathered around to listen to the speech. They would be published everywhere as far as that goes. And then also in the same speech, he mentions the tariff. There was no income tax at the time. Tariff taxes on imports were responsible for over 90% of federal tax revenue taken in. And the average federal tariff tax had been doubled 2 days earlier. Doubled. So the federal rate of taxation was doubled. And he uses the words invasion and bloodshed to describe what will happen to any state that would not collect the tariff tax and send the money to Washington, D.C. He said, it is my duty to collect the duties and imposts, which is what they called tariffs at the time. And then he says, beyond that, there will be no invasion or any bloodshed in any state. So he literally threatened invasion and bloodshed over tax collection. And of course, the southern states they didn't intend to send money to Washington, D.C. any more than they intended to send money to Paris or London.
Right.
And so he kept his word and he invaded.
Wow.
And so if you want to know why there was a war, that's why there was a war, because Lincoln invaded. And also he sent warships to Charleston Harbor, because Charleston Harbor, there was a customs office there, and the Fort Sumter, one of the things it was doing was protecting the customs house. There's a lot of money there. Mm-hmm. That's one of the, and it was meant in general to protect the people of Charleston, South Carolina, from pirates or whoever invaded. Should there ever be an invasion from England or something like that. But he sent warships to instigate the firing on Fort Sumter, and then after they fired on Fort Sumter, he congratulated his naval commander named Gustavus Fox for helping him dupe the Confederates into firing the first shot, so they could be blamed for the war.
Wow!
But that's
Honest Abe,
so. If you understand a little bit about economics, you ask different questions and you come to different conclusions about history.
Yes.
Because you look at history through a different lens, and especially if you understand libertarianism. And then as I researched Lincoln more, he illegally suspended the writ of habeas corpus, had the military mass arrest tens of thousands of political dissenters, shut down over 300 newspapers in the North.
Wow.
There were opposition newspapers. His biggest critic in Congress was a man named Clement Vallandigham from Dayton, Ohio. He deported him. To Canada. He ended up in Canada. They made a movie about it a long time ago called A Man Without a Country. It was about Clement Vallandigham.
Wow.
And after I wrote about this in my book, I had emails from Clement Vallandigham's descendants saying, basically thanking me for speaking favorably about their great-grandfather.
So he squashed freedom of speech, counterfeited currency, attacked his own countrymen, his own tax. I had Dominic Frisby on the show once, and he said something to the effect like the South was a much larger, I hope I'm saying this correctly, it was a much smaller percentage of the total population, but a larger percentage of the total tax base. Yeah. And the South wanted to secede.
Yeah. Well, they've been complaining for years about that. I used to live, I live in Auburn, Alabama now. That's where the Mises Institute is. I moved there from Bluffton, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And I lived in Old Town Bluffton down near the May River. And I have a big picture in my office now of a 300-year-old live oak tree, the kind with the Spanish moss and all, a very beautiful setting. It was in my neighborhood. And it was the scene of the very first meeting of South Carolinians to discuss secession, 1843, almost 2 decades before the Civil War. The issue was there was another big tariff increase. It was called the Black Tariff. It didn't have to do with race, but for some reason it was called the Black Tariff. And they'd had enough of that. They had the tariff of 1828. South Carolina threatened to secede over that, and they forced a compromise tariff that lowered the tariff over 10 years. 10 years was up. The first thing the Congress did, because the North had the votes, raised sky-high tariff rates again. And so they had a meeting of some 500 people under this big live oak tree to discuss seceding from the Union in 1843. And that's the picture that's behind my desk at the Mises. It's a huge, very large thing, takes up half the wall. And I found a decorator that did a really great job finding that. I just told her about this, and she went out and found it.
That's great.
and so that was the beginning of that. And then, so they've been battling this for many years, the tariff, because of discriminating against Southerners. Yeah. Southerners were an agrarian society. They manufactured very little. And so most of the tariffs were on manufactured goods. So they were paying more for farm tools, clothing, shoes, everything. And they also found that, like the Europeans, who would make dollars by selling us these things, had fewer dollars because the protectionist tariffs were drying up their business, people from England or wherever. And so as a result, they couldn't buy as many agricultural products from Americans. And that included tobacco, rice, sugar, things that were grown in the South. So Southerners thought they were being taxed twice. Everything they bought that was manufactured was more expensive. Yeah. And their business was being cut in third or half.
Wow.
Overseas, their overseas business.
Yeah.
And they exported about 3/4 of everything at that point.
Fascinating.
Only the southern farmers. And so
again, money. I mean, you follow the money and you find the truth, right?
That's why an economist like me, who's also a libertarian, got into writing books on Lincoln.
Yeah.
Because you follow the money, and you have a very different interpretation of what's going on.
Yeah.
And when I first started looking into this, I took a course at the Smithsonian. They had all the big shot Ivy League historians, Civil War historians, give speeches, and I asked several of them, is there one book I can read about Lincoln's economics? And they all gave me the same book by a guy named Gabor Boritt, who teaches at Gettysburg College. It's called Lincoln and the American Dream. And I looked at what he says. What did he say about tariffs? And he said Lincoln favored protectionist tariffs because he wanted the common man to have an opportunity to become wealthy like he had become wealthy. And it's just propaganda and baloney.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was supposed to be the book that all these Ivy League professors, of course, they were history professors, so they would write about economic issues all throughout their books, but they were obviously ignorant of economics to say to tell me that this makes sense.
That reinforces my thesis I have is that we're still like coming out of the economic dark ages in a way, like the fact that we're still dominated by Keynesian economics worldwide, and we have central banking.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's a testament to just how ignorant we are of state interference in free markets.
Yeah, people get used to it like they get used to the money being controlled by the government.
Yeah,
Murray Rothbard used to say if the government took over shoe production in the 1700s, people would be saying, well, who would make shoes if the government doesn't make shoes? The government has always made shoes.
Right.
And it's the same with money. But, one of my articles that I wrote on our website was about how, we have abolished several central banks. The first one was called the Bank of North America. It lasted a year because it inflated the currency so much nobody would trust it. Then the first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States. So we've abolished 3 central banks in our history. And who knows that? And so why can't we do it again? I would I'd go on radio talk shows in the last 6 months and say that, and people would be shocked to hear that. But the Bitcoin people like to hear that.
Yeah, well, the idea certainly seems to be gaining traction, right? You've got Massey talking about it, and now Trump and Elon, everyone's sort of flirted with the idea. I want to ask you one other question. This just came up as you were talking about this slavery in the South and whatnot. I recall somewhere in Human Action that Mises said something to the effect that it was actually technological innovation that was going to naturally lead to decline in slavery, right? Because basically capital would amplify labor so much that it would make sense to just pay labor rather than try to enslave people. Do you recall that portion of the book? Or?
Yeah. Well, that's why, slaves existed in all the states at one point.
Yeah.
I went to an exhibit at the New York History Museum right next to Central Park maybe 10 or 12 years ago called Slavery in New York. And they published a book. There's a book on Amazon you can buy called Slavery in New York. There were slaves in New York City as late as 1853.
Wow.
So and they all found a way to end slavery peacefully because it was uneconomical in the North. Once the North became manufacturing became the thing in the North, agriculture in Massachusetts is, the soil's too rocky, it's acidic, it's not good for agriculture. And so they all found a way to end slavery peacefully in northern states, but they did it for economic reasons. And Mises wrote that, capital is one thing, but also free labor is inherently more productive than slave labor.
Sure.
If you're a slave, there's nothing in it for you to accumulate more skill and what economists call human capital because somebody's expropriating your human capital. But if you're a free man or free woman and you educate yourself and you become more skilled at your craft, there's something in it for you.
And there's the enforcement cost too, right?
Yeah.
You have to literally trap the slaves, hurt the slaves, control
Well, the slave, the African chieftains are the ones who trapped the slaves.
Yeah.
They were the original slave owners, and the Europeans and later on the Americans, they just went to the coast of Africa. They didn't go into the interior where there's tigers, lions, and bears, and malaria and all that. They stood by the coast and they bought slaves from the slave owners, which were the African kings.
Yeah.
Those are the original ones, slave owners. So if you want reparations for slavery, that's where you need to start, is the descendants of the African kings.
And there's a story there too with the agri beads, the slave beads, right? That they were using glass beads as money in Western Africa.
Oh, yeah.
And then Europeans started shipping that in, basically counterfeiting it, using it to acquire these slaves and other goods. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing the things that have been tried to use as money. Coconuts, all sorts of weird things over the years, shells.
Indeed.
If you read history, you read about this. It's all.
Indeed.
They didn't work out too well, but that's how the market works. It's trial and error until that's how we hit on gold and silver eventually.
Right.
And who knows if Bitcoin will be around 50 years from now, but there's got to be a lot. There's already competition in competing currencies.
Absolutely.
Cryptocurrencies, and let the market decide.
Amen to that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Mises Institute. So you already said you guys are not a think tank.
Yeah.
What is the mission of the Mises Institute?
It's economic education and research, broadly defined. We publish books. We hold conferences. We have all sorts of student conferences. We have our big event of the year is called Mises University. We usually have 120 to 150 students from all over the world that come in for a 7-day boot camp in Austrian economics, and it stays with them. They keep studying as they go on. A lot of them go to graduate school themselves. And the last summer in July, we had 106 students, and we had 18 faculty, and 13 of the faculty were themselves graduates of Mises University when they were undergraduates. Wow. They went on to earn PhD degrees and have academic careers, and now they're teaching in our programs. So it has a long-term effect in that regard. And we teach about the free market, Austrian school economics. Also, we teach about government. Not only what has government done to our money, but what has government done to just about everything else, as far as our research and our teaching goes. And it's in the tradition of the Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, Friedrich Hayek. We just got a big donation from a very generous donor to produce a new book of essays by Hayek. He himself is a fan of Hayek, and I mentioned earlier that we gave away 100,000 copies of Economics One Lesson. We're going to shoot to give away 100,000 copies of this book of essays by Friedrich Hayek.
And when you give them away, how do you distribute them? Where do you go?
It's on our website, and we have 3.2 million unique viewers of our website every year. And so it's Mises.org. And so we put it up on our website. We have fundraising letters, and when we mention we have publications that we send out. We have a mailing list of about 7,000 people that we send out to electronically and once in a while in print as well for special events. And we inform people about this. We had another donor who gave us enough money to have a full-page ad in a Wall Street Journal last June entitled "Who Needs the Fed?" Making the case for abolishing the Fed. A full-page Wall Street Journal ad. And at the bottom of the ad, we said, if you want a free copy of what has government done to our money, here's where you can get it. And so we gave away thousands of books, and we got, I think, almost 4,000 new people sign up as donors for. And I'm not talking about people giving us $1 million, but something. Yeah. We have donors who give us $10 a month, and we have people who leave their as a bequest when they die, and things like that. So
that's incredible.
So that's some of the things that we do, but we're not a think tank. We don't get involved in politics. We do discuss issues of the day. When Trump a couple of weeks ago said when his inaugural address said William McKinley is his new favorite hero because he was a big protectionist, and so I wrote an article for our website on McKinley, and the McKinley tariff passed in the year 1890, and it was such a disaster that McKinley himself was voted out of office, and the Democrat, he was a Republican, the Democrats took over both houses and the presidency. Grover Cleveland became president, and the Democrats had a 3-1 margin in the House, and that's supposed to be a good Trump's role model of a politician. Yeah. So we're not afraid to. we like a lot of things Trump is doing with deregulation and cutting the spending and all that. We'll praise him for that.
Yeah.
But when he does dumb things economically, we'll call him out on that pretty severely too.
Sure. So why name it after Mises? Like, what is it about the spirit of Mises that the Institute is trying to keep going?
Well, it's like we talked about earlier. It's the great tradition of Austrian school scholarship that just stands so head and shoulders above the boring and inconsequential mainstream that is so wrapped up in themselves and their math and their. It was pathetic after the crash of '08, which was predicted by the Austrian economists, was predicted on television by Ron Paul in 2005 that there's a bubble in real estate, it's going to burst. And that it's because we understand we have a theory of the business cycle. One of the unique things about Austrian economics is the understanding that the boom and bust are caused by the central banks.
Yes.
That's what causes the business cycle to be so
that's the crowning achievement
radical.
of Mises, right? Is the Austrian business cycle
Mises
theory.
wrote his theory of money in the early 20th century. And so and Murray Rothbard. So we hope to carry on the intellectual tradition of these great scholars like Mises and Hayek and Murray Rothbard. And of course the libertarianism of Murray Rothbard. So peace, real true history, and free market capitalism, not crony capitalism, is the things that we try to educate people on.
Amazing. And then how has it been? Like, are you seeing interest in Austrian economics increase over time? Like, how successful have you been in educating people on these principles?
Well, there are several Mises institutes around the world now. There's one in Brazil, one in Japan, one in Poland. The one in Poland was a Mises University student of ours who went on, got a PhD degree in Poland in economics, and he runs his own Mises Institute there now.
Wow. And
as an anecdote, a really fun thing that happened last July, there's a UFC fighter named Renato Moicano.
Oh, yeah.
And he
trying to get him on the show.
He was a big underdog in a fight. He won this fight, and Joe Rogan is interviewing him, and he grabs the microphone from Joe Rogan. He says, "I want to make a statement." And he said, "If you care about your country, you will read Ludwig von Mises."
Yes, yes.
And I'm sure everybody there is wondering, who the hell is Ludwig von Mises?
Right.
And so one of Mises' books is called, I think it's called Economic Policy for Today and Tomorrow, which Renato has read.
Yeah.
It became the #1 book on Amazon of all economics books sold on Amazon. And we immediately invited him to speak at Mises University, by the way. And I'm still working on it. We have a publicist, and I told him we need to get him for this July. So that's your assignment. I told this guy, you need to get Renato Moicano to come and speak at our event because he lives in Florida.
Yeah, he does live in Florida. Yeah. I've been DMing him on Instagram, and he's agreed to come on the show. We haven't lined it up yet, but I'll definitely if we do get him, I'll point him your way.
Okay, we had a T-shirt made up with his image on the back. We did it legally. We made sure we didn't violate anybody's copyright or anything. We got his image on the back and saying that if you care about your country, So we have it for sale we have a bookstore. We had it for sale, and then Dr. Robert Malone,
famous. He's also been on the show.
You know who Mo Malone is?
Yeah.
Out of the blue, around the same time last July, out of the blue, he has a Substack column that has 500,000 readers. Yeah. He writes a big review of what has government done to our money on his Substack. Amazing. He's a doctor. He's a medical researcher. Yeah. And also, there's an essay by Murray Rothbard called Anatomy of the State.
Oh,
and then he did a big review of that in the same article.
Amazing.
And so we did the same thing. We just immediately, I called our publicist and said, invite Dr. Malone, see if he can come. And our publicist said, well, it so happens that I'm his agent. and so he came. He gave a talk at our Mises University. The students absolutely loved it. It was on his new book, Psy Wars. Yeah. And I haven't checked lately, but the last I looked, it was approaching. I think he had 800,000 views on YouTube and our website.
Amazing.
Yeah, and so it'll be 1 million pretty soon.
That's
I think
fantastic.
It's still going.
I'm so. It's so heartening to see these ideas spreading, right? You know, the pain helps, right? The pandemic period over the past 4 or 5 years has really opened a lot of eyes, right? A lot of people are like, something's not right here. What's going on? People have gone on their own paths of inquiry, right? Like what's the problem? And well, if you ask long enough, you end up finding, hopefully you end up following the money and finding the truth to some extent. I'm really glad you guys are doing that. Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware's mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few strokes of the keyboard. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your miner's energy bill for the first week of each of your mining rigs when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. Onramp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. Onramp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-key vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control over your keys. Your funds are fully auditable on-chain, cannot be rehypothecated, and can only move or be withdrawn at your explicit direction. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. Bitcoin is money, and as the price continues to appreciate, OnRamp helps you seamlessly tap into financial services like trading, inheritance, insurance, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security or accessibility. Schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team to learn more at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Let's shift gears a little bit. So for someone that's just completely outside the sphere of economics and doesn't know the difference between Austrian versus Keynesian economics, how do you approach that individual? Like, because these ideas can be dense, especially when I'm reading Austrian economics, sometimes it's very dense. It's difficult to read. As you mentioned earlier about Keynesian economics, it's overly mathematized and it's just bullshit, but you can't really tell why. Mm-hmm. And so how do you demystify this space, and how do you explain to people why Austrian economics is superior or more truthful than Keynesian economics?
If people, for decades have been asking to find out what I do for a living or a little bit about me, and I always point them to books like Economics in One Lesson, or The Law by Friedrich Bastiat. Mm-hmm. Or there's also a book, one of Mises' books called Liberalism, that explains classical liberalism or libertarianism, really. And I recommend that to everybody. It's online on our website. You can buy it from us. Also, it explains why there's a case for a free society based on free trade, private property, honest money, and it's plain English, as far as Mises could write plain English, because he had this Germanic touch to all of his writing. It makes it a little difficult sometimes. And so there's literature like that. But if you want to explain, the difference, Keynesianism is basically an apparatus for central planning, and it's the approach taken by the Keynesian economists is they see themselves as advisors to central planners. and they use this very confusing apparatus to try to impress upon the politicians, this is how you should centrally plan the economy. So they have a lot of hubris about it. Keynes himself, in the German edition of his book, The General Theory, said this would work best in a totalitarian society. Well, because the economists can tell you this is what you should do, but then you have to go through Congress. And Congress could take a year or two to do what you say you should do. And so Keynes said, no, this would work better in a totalitarian society where the dictator could just say, do this today, rather than waiting for democracy to work itself out. But Austrian economics, it tries to uphold the tradition of teaching people the spontaneous order of markets, of how markets work, markets for everything, market for money, the market for goods, and everything. You're going to be bamboozled by not only the politicians, but what we call their court historians, academics who are one way or another on the take by the government to make excuses for the government. And the more you learn about the truth about how markets really work and real capitalism versus crony capitalism, the less you'll be bamboozled by politicians for the rest of your life. We call it de-bamboozlement. We're in the de-bamboozlement business. And that was a Murray Rothbard term. He liked to talk about bamboozling and de-bamboozling.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I want to know what you think about this approach, because people have posed a similar question to me before. And I came at it this way. I said, look, in economic reality, you have to produce before you can consume, right?
Yes.
You need to grow the crops before you can eat the crops, right? Or harvest the crops. Keynesian economics inverts that, right? They say, oh, if there's a problem in the economy, you need to print money, you need to stimulate consumption to get production going again. And so it's like kind of like the tail wagging the dog situation. Could you speak to that a little bit? Of like, what are the economic principles that Keynesianism inverts or gets wrong that Austrian economics gets right?
Yeah, well, you just stated it. They have everything ass backwards as far as that goes. My first year in graduate school, I mentioned something about my first microeconomics class. My first macroeconomics class, one of the books was The General Theory by John Maynard Keynes, and a big, long list of articles from academic journals. And one of the articles was in a British academic journal by Keynes explaining his general theory. This was 1936. It was published, and I read it clear as a bell, what he was having to say. But I think to this day, no one has really understood the general theory, his book. And I think it's convoluted on purpose. Yeah. So, and then the academics made a big deal at the time about, this famous Cambridge economist. And but he basically didn't say anything that people have been saying for several hundred years about what used to be called mercantilism. That was sort of the European economic system of the 17th century. And it's just basically a system of public policies that help producers at the expense of consumers, among other things. And they had all these superstitions, which are all in the general theory, like it's sort of zero opportunity cost thinking that the government can spend money and create wealth. And where's it come from? Where's the money? Where's the money come from? Nobody, like you said, nobody produces anything to create the wealth first, and then it is taxed. It just it's just there. It's like, let's assume we have money and we'll spend it. And of course, politicians latched onto that because he made an argument in favor of why deficit spending is a good thing in a depression. And so that morphed into deficit spending is always a good thing, not just during a depression. In one of my professor's books, James Buchanan, with Richard Wagner, the Austrian who I mentioned was my microeconomics professor in graduate school, wrote a book called Democracy and Deficit. And the subtitle is The Political Legacy of Lord Keynes. And what it's about is how if you apply the practice of Keynesian economics, the politicians never pay attention to what the Keynesian economists say unless it suits their political career. It'll promote their political career. So if the Keynesian economists say if there's inflation, one thing you can do to tame it is raise taxes, because they think, take money out of people's pockets, they'll spend less. So it's all about the demand side, Keynesian economics. And so
crazy,
but a politician,
by the way.
if it happens to be an election coming up, they're not going to raise your taxes right before the election, even if the economists say that's what you're supposed to do. So the book is about how, as bad as Keynesian economics is, theoretically, in practice, it's just all over the place. The politicians will do what they think is good for them, not what's good for the country in terms of economic policy. And that's the grand illusion that all of these economic advisors have to the president. They think they'll take their advice, but they don't.
Man, it's that particular point flabbergasted me, right? When we say, okay, if price inflation is too high, and the price inflation was caused by monetary inflation, monetary inflation is the counterfeiting of currency, which is the stealing of purchasing power from savers. If we've stolen too much purchasing power from savers, the solution is let's go steal more via direct taxation. It is so crazy when you boil it down that people believe this.
And inflation is a regressive tax. If the price level goes up by 10%, if you're a millionaire, it's not going to hurt too much. But if you're the lady I mentioned earlier, the cleaning woman who has a job at the university, who comes in and cleans up the bathrooms every night, 10% increase in the cost of living is going to hurt her a lot more. And the same as if they raise the taxes in general, to fight inflation.
The recently proposed Inflation Reduction Act was also cracking me up.
And the Keynesians will also say if there's a recession, one of their recommendations is you're supposed to cut taxes. But when did you ever hear of anyone in Washington say that? We need. Well, the Republicans once in a while do that, but they don't advertise themselves as Keynesians. But you've never heard a Keynesian Democrat in Washington say, well, in a recession, we need a tax cut. No, never.
And Mises has made the point, too. The only way you can ever fully eliminate institutional unemployment is to not have a minimum wage or any other obstruction in the market for labor, right? Supply and demand need to clear wherever they clear. But if you put in a minimum wage, well, you've basically got a price floor. So you're going to create unemployment through a legal mechanism.
That's what happened during the Great Depression. FDR made the Great Depression much worse because that's when they had increased. They had the minimum wage was instituted, and he empowered labor unions with special laws favorable to them that enabled them to push up prices during the Great Depression, or wages rather, and it drove even more people out of jobs. It's like, there's another point I took away from Mises's book, Human Action, is that essentially all government activity or spending is a misallocation of capital. Like, it's unavoidable because there's always the theft that originates the funding for that activity. So what you're not, it's kind of like Hazlitt's seen versus the unseen, right? You see the government spending and building and doing whatever. What you don't see is what the people who were robbed would have done with that money had they not been taxed or inflated on. A good example would be foreign aid, which you mentioned earlier. That investment. If you're talking about investment in infrastructure like oil wells and things like that, an entrepreneur who's pursuing profit will want to put oil wells in where he thinks there's oil. A farmer who wants to build a grain storage will want to make it accessible to his farm so he can put his grain in the grain. But I have a book at home about foreign aid. The author's name is Osterfeld, David Osterfeld, and it goes over the history of American foreign aid. And there are examples of where the politicians get to allocate the capital in form of oil wells and things like that. They have literally financed oil wells in countries with no oil, and they have built grain storage facilities in places that are inaccessible to farmers. Just anything. And it's really the people who build and make money building oil wells. That's who benefit. That's who their clients are, because that's who's bribing the politicians to do this in Zambia or wherever they're doing it. And the same with the agricultural thing. And so the entrepreneur wants to make money. And how do you make money? You please a lot of customers. That's how you make money in the free market. But when politicians get this money, they use politics and potential for bribes to decide what gets built and where. There's
no accountability to the preferences of consumers, and so you just you build shit that no one wants. And
well, that's the whole idea, isn't it? that Yeah, the old John Kenneth Galbraith, I don't know if you remember him. He was a hero of the left for many years. And he wrote book after book about the evils of advertising. And the theme of all the books was that advertising induces us to spend money on things we don't really need, like more government. Like we need more government, he would say. Yeah. And so he made that argument about the evils of advertising because his goal was to say we need to raise taxes and have bigger government, and our politicians will more wisely spend our money than we do.
Crazy.
It just has the world upside down.
Yeah.
Who's to say they spend the money more wisely than we do? Look at what Trump is uncovering today.
Yeah, it's quite the opposite. And I think we know this if we apply intuition to our own experience. It's like if someone just gives you money and you didn't earn it, well, it's much easy come, easy go, right? It's much easy to spend that money foolishly. Yeah. But if you earn it, then you know the cost of it. Yeah. You know the blood, sweat, and tears it took to acquire it. Yeah. Well, then you're going to be more cautious and prudent with that spending. Yeah. Why would we expect that to be any different at any other, at the governmental level?
Yeah. So that's not the only person who knows how wisely your money is spent is you. Exactly. Because it's all subjective.
Yes.
And so politicians, Hayek in his last book, he called this phenomenon the pretense of knowledge. The idea that politicians know better how to plan an economy than you and I know how to plan our lives and our occupations and everything like that. Yeah. And that's and that was Hayek argued that was one of the main reasons for why socialism never worked or never could work. Yeah. Is that they pretend that they have all this knowledge. That's why the famous essay "I Pencil" by Leonard Read is still so good. Crucially important. Yeah. It explains how the economic world works in a decentralized information. We all have information about our jobs. I have a friend who is a manager for a landscaping company, and she tells me, you're a professor, I can never do your job. I can't imagine being and I just tell her, I can never do your job either. I'd be fired after one day managing a landscaping company. Yeah. And so it's not that I have a special knowledge, I just have different knowledge. Right. We all do that, and I make money doing what I do. Yeah. And then I'll hire your landscaping company to do the landscaping in my yard. And that's the way the economic world works. It doesn't mean I'm smarter than you or anything like that.
No. Yeah,
it's different knowledge,
Yeah, and the nature of knowledge is to be pertinent and specific to the person in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular context, under particular circumstances. Yeah. And so, Hayek's other essay that I love on that is the use of knowledge in society. Yeah. Right. He brilliantly lays that out. Yeah. And so it's we're trying to, in central planning, the other point he makes, it's not actually, it's centralized planning versus decentralized planning, basically, right? Like the individual actor gets to plan for themselves, or do they depend on some monolithic institution to tell them what to do? Yeah. And that feedback, where if they have to pass that information up into the monolithic institution and then wait for the orders to come back down from on high, the knowledge loses its relevance, its value. Like you're disrupting the flow of data, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Whereas in a decentralized planning or free market capitalistic system, people can just act on the knowledge they have, the expertise that they have. Yeah. And that seems so obvious, right? It's a decentralized computing problem versus centralized computing. You're going to get a lot more throughput in a decentralized computing system than you are a centralized one.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of it gets lost or distorted by the government. Yeah. And who lies more than the government, by the way, as far as information goes. And in Hayek's famous book, The Road to Serfdom, he says the real issue is who is to do the planning. We all plan. Everybody plans. Right. You plan your day. Right. You let alone your career and your family, everything else. But who is to do the planning? Do you want some faceless bureaucrat at the Department of Energy or wherever to plan your life for you?
Yeah, and the other component that's not talked about enough, I think central planning is way too nice of a term because the plan that's centrally planned that other people don't want to adopt, because that would be the decentralized plan, has to be imposed, right? It necessitates coercion. Yeah. So it's like I call it individualism versus coercivism, basically.
Yeah. Well, that's why the socialists of the 20th century murdered hundreds of millions of people who were the dissenters. 6 million Ukrainians, and go on down the list. I used to teach a class called Capitalism and Its Critics. And I would have the good guys and the bad guys. I'd have essays by Hayek and Mises and Mar Rothbard, and then I'd read the Communist Manifesto next to that. And there's a book called Democide.
Oh yeah,
by a University of Hawaii sociologist, and it's a listing of people who were murdered by their own governments, not in a war, but just dissenters who dissented, and there, Mao Zedong, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, all the rest of them, and some students of mine. One of my students was the head of college Republicans, and they had this day where the students all signed up for a club, and so they all had little tables set up on the campus in the middle of the campus, and he printed out one page from Democide of number of people killed by governments. And he said all day, they sat out there for hours. He said not one student had knew anything about this. He didn't know one person had been killed by socialism because they were always taught that it's all just free stuff.
Right.
You know, Bernie Sanders comes on campus and they're all in love with Bernie Sanders. Free stuff forever.
Bamboozled.
You know, mom and dad are paying for everything now. I'm going to graduate and the government will still keep paying for everything. You know, I got it made. Bernie Sanders for president.
It's utterly crazy. I remember that data table in Democide. I think it said 170 million people murdered by the state in the 20th century. So that's like half the, one out of two people in the U.S. basically murdered legally by the state.
Yeah, I wrote an article for the Mises.org once on the missing chapter of Democide, which is the American Civil War. Southerners dissented. They no longer consented to be governed by Washington, D.C., and probably about 400,000 of them were killed and 1 million maimed for life during the war. And the same with the northern side, about the same number, if not more, of deaths, according to the latest research. The latest research says that maybe as many as 850,000 died in the Civil War.
Yes.
And that's when the population of the country was about 10% of what it is today.
Wow. Yeah, I'm reminded of Nietzsche's famous quote, right? Everything the state says is a lie. Everything the state has is stolen. And I don't know. I don't know how people get tricked or hypnotized into believing that the state is their friend. It's like I've never seen... I'm like, open a history book and show me. Like, what have you got? I've seen one shred of evidence.
Government control of education, which is also in the Communist Manifesto.
Yes,
that's
which we have
from elementary school. You're taught these things. Like I said, I grew up in Pennsylvania. Went to public school, and I can remember being forced to recite the Gettysburg Address almost every day.
Crazy.
Crazy. Yeah, which is a politician's speech, and some people say it wasn't even written by Lincoln; it was written by somebody else, and as political speeches often are. And so so we start the day with political propaganda in elementary school, and and that was way back when. It's bound to be much worse today.
Yes.
But I taught at the University of Tennessee for a while, and
I went to school at UT.
In the summer. Somebody came up to me and said, we have a group of public school teachers and they have some sort of economic credit they can get for some kind of course they were taking, and they want to know if I could have a class and just talk to them about something about economics. And at the time, my professor, James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize, won it for a sub-discipline in economics called public choice. It's a sort of economic analysis of political decision-making. It's all about the incentives in politics. So I gave sort of a Econ 101 level talk to these teachers. And they all came up to me later and said they loved it, they really liked it, and they said, we could never teach this in our classrooms, though, because these are government schools, and it's too critical of government to do this. Man. And my first year teaching out of graduate school, my first job was at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and I had published several articles in academic journals in the area of public finance, and it didn't state and local public finance, in these academic journals, and it was kind of critical of some of the things politicians were doing. And I had a senior faculty member come to me to give me sort of fatherly advice, tell me I shouldn't be publishing articles like that. They're too critical of the government, even though they were in prestigious journals. That's what I was supposed to be doing as a first-year college professor, publishing articles in academic journals. But even then, I was being advised, don't step on the toes of any politicians.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how many people live in fear, and then they suggest other people to also live in fear, and that is not a good way to make decisions, honestly.
No. Yeah.
One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. Knowing when to buy Bitcoin can feel complicated, and knowing how much to buy can be overwhelming, and getting started can be a headache, but it doesn't have to be. That's exactly why I recommend Coinbits, because it solves these major blockers and it's the easiest way to buy Bitcoin. With Coinbits' Roundups feature, you can automatically convert your spare change into Bitcoin while you shop. For example, when you buy a coffee for $3.50, the extra 50 cents is rounded up and it goes straight into Bitcoin. Here's why that's a huge win for you. Because you don't have to be a tech wizard or try to time the market just right with Bitcoin. With Coinbits Roundups, you simply set it, shop, and stack sats. And you can set this up in under 2 minutes. Just visit the website, connect your card, and boom, you're buying a little Bitcoin every time you spend money. So stop wasting your time with complicated exchanges or confusing shitcoin apps. Coinbits simplifies your Bitcoin savings strategy. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove. Again, that's coinbits.app/breedlove. Let's talk about sound money. Hayek has the very infamous quote, "I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government." That is, we can't take it violently out of the hands of government. All we can do is by some sly, roundabout way introduce something that they can't stop.
Yeah.
So what are your views on the moral imperativeness and the moral implications of sound money? Like, why is this such an important thing, and what are the problems that it really purports to solve?
Excuse me. Yeah, that's probably from his book Competition and Currency, and we're, I mentioned earlier that we at the Mises Institute are going to publish a book of essays by Hayek this year, and one of his essays on competition and currency will be included in that. And yeah, that's what we have to do. I've been doing interviews about ending the Fed. We did a documentary called "Playing with Fire" about ending the Fed, and I've been telling them that it's a sort of a stepping stone to ending the Fed would be encouraging more competition in currency, and show people that there is an alternative. There are alternatives to government monopoly of money, and once they see that, they're going to like it. They like competition in the sale of eggs or cars or anything else.
Yeah, more quality, lower prices.
Yeah, that's what everybody who ever took economics is taught, but except for the money, supposedly. And so all of these things that we complain about, the conservatives especially complain about the unconstitutionality of this and the unconstitutionality, the Constitution is dead. Well, the legalized counterfeiting by the Fed is what has caused the death of the Constitution, because it is allowed. That's what has allowed the government to do all these things, to wage all these wars without even bothering to get congressional consent for the past 75 years or something like that. That they haven't even bothered. No one even makes the argument for that. And why would it be? Where's one of the delegated powers that we're allowed to spend send hundreds of billions of dollars to the dictator of Ukraine, who has canceled elections and kicked out the Russian Orthodox Church, things like that.
Yeah.
That's our new ally.
Yeah.
And so there are delegated powers in the Constitution, and of course they've been ignored for a long time. But the legalized counterfeiting monopoly allows the government to do all of this.
Yes.
And especially getting into these wars in the first place. So just that is a big moral argument against the government monopoly of the currency. Just that. And then just the whole immorality of creating this gigantic Leviathan state in Washington, which is, somebody recently described Washington, D.C. as one giant crime scene today. It was in the context of what Elon Musk has been discovering of how the money is spent. And
Yes.
I think they said there's 100 million accounts at the Treasury Department that have no Social Security number attached to them, no identification number. They don't know who got this money or how it was spent. And he says he thinks at least half of it has to be just theft.
Yeah.
It's just probably, I'm guessing it's probably all these institutions of the Democrat Party, all these NGOs and the nonprofits and all that, that's where that money goes. I wrote a whole book about this. I co-authored a book called Destroying Democracy, published in 1985. It was a co-author and I got all this data on the federal grants, data to nonprofit organizations, so-called. And the way it worked then, this is the mid-1980s, some nonprofit would be created and they claimed they want to help the poor people. So, who could object to that? And they would be given millions of dollars by the government, but a big chunk of it, usually most of it, would be used on politics, on lobbying and campaigning for left-wing politicians. And it's illegal to do that, but they did it anyway. This was during the Carter administration, and we got all this data. And we called it Destroying Democracy because, James Madison famously said the purpose of the Constitution is to limit the problem of faction. He meant the special interest politics. But here, the argument was government is actually subsidizing faction or politics, in the direction of they wanted it to go into, actually using tax dollars and printed dollars to give to all these organizations. So I think that's what Elon Musk is going to find, that this whole apparatus, the media included, are being paid millions and millions and billions in tax dollars to prop up the Democrat Party. That's why they're so hysterical. You had Maxine Waters trying to break down the front door to the Department of Education on TV the other night to protest, because she doesn't want the people to reveal what she has received. And somebody also asked, how is it that the Clintons have a net worth of $200 million? What product have they produced? How did that happen?
Fucking crazy. It is clown world at its worst, I think, when you start, once again, follow the money and you find the truth. And I'm happy to see people following the money more closely in the wake of the Trump election. Something you brought up there is another area of my deep curiosity. The ability to print money, we already mentioned it, it gives you this funding mechanism to wage the forever wars, right? You don't need to tax your population or borrow. You just print the money and go to war forever until the currency hyperinflates, basically. Another aspect of that that's pretty pernicious is that you can also use the stolen purchasing power to manipulate media and manipulate narratives and fund propaganda. Like we mentioned this with Keynesian economics, right? You can justify the printing of money by using the proceeds stolen through the printing of money by creating this academic paradigm that supports the printing of money. But you can also do these things, to a lesser extent, just in the media, just creating stories or, manufacturing consent, maybe to use the Chomskyan term. What do you think about that? Like, is this another aspect of the way printing money can corrupt the soul? Because it can, people can use it as like a form of mind control in a way by manipulating the media and whatnot.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually been in the news recently, just in the last couple of days, not the news, but online that I've been reading that some of the money that Elon Musk has discovered with the Treasury data is going to media outlets all over the place. That's what they use USAID, Agency for International Development, for. And so when you see these rabid people on TV and the TV news calling Trump Hitler and things like that, they're being paid by the incumbent, which was Biden at the time, to do some of that. And another thing I've written about regarding the media is, when you think about it, if you're a reporter and you're covering, say, environmental news, you have to have relationships with the EPA, because that's where a lot of the news comes from, the Environmental Protection Agency or the state Environmental Protection Agency. If you're too critical, they'll cut you off and your career is done as a journalist. So just that tells you that with government, because of government, you can't really have honest journalism, because so much of what's covered today, government is so big and pervasive today, that's how it works. And if government was much smaller, the news would be different. You might cover something other than politics, but that seems like all they talk about now on TV. Sure. A friend of mine had moved here from Canada, and I don't know what Canada's like. I never lived there, but she was from South Africa, and then she moved to Canada. And then when she moved to the U.S., she moved to Seattle, she noticed the difference. She said, boy, our money has nice beautiful pictures of Lake Louise on it, and yours has all mugshots of politicians, and your news is all politics. And she said, well, they cover politics in Canada, but it's not the only thing that's on the news. But that's one of the things that really struck her when she finally moved to the U.S., was that. And it's like that. And so so when we learn now that they actually are being paid, I knew they were being paid by the pharmaceutical companies. Everybody knows that. Right. And so they're not going to criticize any drug.
Of course.
And they're going to hate Robert Kennedy Jr.
Right.
But just like they hated Trump. But I don't know. He'll probably make it. I think from what I've been reading, we'll see.
Oh, RFK getting confirmed. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely less. I always am hesitant to put my faith in any. I just don't put my faith in politicians. I just try to, it's good that we have the less bad administration. Is basically the extent of what I can say. I also don't vote because, was it Rothbard you said that doesn't vote? Who was it?
Murray Rothbard.
Murray Rothbard, yeah.
Yeah, I wrote an essay once on LouRockwell.com. I've been a columnist for decades on that. It says, be patriotic, don't vote.
Yes,
because just about everything government does is unconstitutional. Right. So you're just supporting unconstitutional government.
Opt out.
So because it only legitimizes, because if they could no longer say the people have given us a mandate,
bingo,
that'd be a good thing.
Bingo.
But they all say that though.
Yeah. So given these pernicious aspects of money printing and how it causes the forever wars and distorts media narrative and truth discovery and all of this, what would you expect our world to look like if we were to return to a sound money standard? And I say return to, I mean, I don't know that we've ever had a firm footing on sound money, but we've had periods where we had more of a sound money system. What do you think that world would look like?
Well, I could look to American history. We got rid of the last central bank in the early 1840s. The second bank of the United States disappeared, and we didn't get another one until 1913. We had government regulation of banking, and they would do things every once in a while. They would suspend specie payment by law, where you couldn't redeem currency in gold and silver. They did once in a while. They did that. They regulated branch banking. So you had some regulation, but you didn't have a central bank. And there are several books. There's an economist named Richard Timberlake, taught at the University of Georgia for many years, and he wrote a big history. He taught monetary economics for like 40 years at the university, and this was his big treatise at the end. And there are several others also like this that say that period, well, not perfect, roughly from the 1840s to the turn of the 20th century, but it was the most stable monetary system we've ever had. And we're still on the gold standard, and there was no central bank, and we had deflation. From the Civil War to the turn of the century, we had deflation. And that's what we should be having today with all the technology we've got and are getting.
Specifically,
everything should be getting cheaper.
Price deflation, yes.
We said price deflation should be getting massive price deflation now. But the government, the best the Fed can do is they say, well, our target is at least a 2% pay cut for every American every year, meaning 2% price inflation.
Right.
That's what they say.
Yeah.
And of course, they never made that target, and they would lie about the real price inflation rate anyway.
Yeah.
And if you look up shadowstats.com, they compute, they use the old formula from the 1980s, and they get a very different answer for inflation than the government gives you now.
Yeah. Yeah, they conveniently strip out the things whose prices change too much.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, well, what
energy and food. Yeah, we don't count that.
Who needs those?
It is, yeah.
Okay, so what are your views on Bitcoin? I mean, I guess let's put gold in here too. Obviously, gold is the non-digital sound money that's been around for 5,000 years. Yeah. You know, countries have gone off and on of gold standards throughout other monetary metals as well, but gold's sort of proven itself to be the dominant one, at least since like the 1800s forward. Yeah. Bitcoin's much newer, obviously. It's 15 some odd years old. It's a digital sound money. How do you view these two things? Like, how do you view, obviously sound money is very important. Do you think we need to have both? One of the other, just let the market decide? How do you approach all this?
Yeah, there was a debate held at the Mises Institute a couple of years ago about gold versus Bitcoin, about which one is going to be more dominant 20 years from now or something like that. And both people made a very strong case for one for Bitcoin, one for gold. But the market will reveal that. I think it's a great thing that cryptocurrency has come about, and Bitcoin in particular. And it's still too unstable for people to think of it as a good store of value for most people anyway, because they see the volatility in it. And it's a good thing that I know the politicians hate it, so that's a good thing. that's a good thing for it. Yeah. And when they let Ross Ulbricht out of jail, all he did was facilitate a way for people to trade online without government knowing every aspect of what you're doing. And of course there's crime committed with paper dollars just as much as you can commit a crime using Bitcoin and anything else. So I don't agree with that argument that criminals are using cryptocurrency. Well, like, criminals were using money laundering during Al Capone's day, and before that, probably the Roman Empire day, probably. In fact, Lincoln established the Secret Service to police counterfeiting, competition with the greenback dollar. That's why there was the original purpose of the Secret Service.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. He also imposed taxes on competing currencies because there were still competing currencies during the Civil War. So they adopted the greenback dollar as a monopoly money and taxed the rest of them out of business at the time. Yeah. Did you know that?
Just a shitcoiner defending his turf, huh?
Yeah. And the word Dixie, the land, Dixieland, land of Dixie.
South. Yeah.
That comes from the Dix. Dix is 10 in French. And there was a bank in New Orleans that the Dix was its currency. And it was almost 100% gold reserve backed currency. And it was so popular that it was even used in Minnesota.
Wow.
And that's where Dixie comes from. And so we had a number of competing currencies like that prior to the Civil War, but they were all taxed out of business to establish the greenback dollar as a monopoly money.
Wow.
During the Lincoln regime.
Interesting.
So I'm optimistic that we'll let the market tell us Bitcoin, gold, or who knows what might come down the pike next year or sometime in the future. But that's my attitude toward markets in general. I don't. Someone once asked me. When politicians sometimes ask people to make a prediction, but I look at places, countries that are repressive, and if they all of a sudden adopt freedom, politicians will also always want to know a question like, well, how many grocery stores do you think there will be in the Ukraine if they had peace in Ukraine and free markets? Well. I don't know, but I know there'd be more. But people will be happier if you do have more economic freedom. Yeah. And the same with money. If we have competition in currency, the reason why Bitcoin exists is a lot of people like it, like using it, and for a store of wealth and for whatever other reason.
Yeah.
And the same as any other cryptocurrency. And so we'll see. I don't know if these two guys that debated at the Mises Institute and made very strong cases for gold and a very strong case for Bitcoin. I don't know. They could both be right. They could both be wrong. Something else.
Do you
might
recall
come
who
along.
it was?
I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was, but you could probably Google it and find out.
Yeah, I mean,
who it
it's
was.
like, again, this is a very core principle of economics, right?
Yeah.
Is that as long as we have competition occurring within the limiting principle of private property, right? That the competition doesn't become violent or coercive.
Yeah.
Well, then we drive prices down, product prices down, and product quality up.
Yeah.
Right, so the consumer is the one that benefits
That's
from
the
all
whole
that
history of
competition.
the world. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all. Like, it's really that simple. That's the game we want to play.
And your wages go up if the prices go down. Your real wages go up.
Exactly.
Yeah, Hayek. The Austrian position on competition, the market is a dynamic discovery process. And we discover how to produce things better and cheaper. We discover what we like as consumers.
Consumer preferences.
I don't know what I'm going to like 5 years from now.
Right.
Who would have said in 1950, boy, I would really like to have a personal computer.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we discover these things.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's this is where I love the book Human Action, that Mises calls the market a process, and it is that. It's price discovery process. You could also say kind of like a truth discovery process. Like, what's the best way to solve these problems, right? Well, the market and entrepreneurs figure it out. And not only do they figure it out once, it's like they figure it out continuously.
Well, that's how gold came about. People used all sorts of things, some of them very weird, as money. And they finally settled in gold and silver primarily.
Yeah.
And so that was a dynamic discovery process. It took a long time. And it's the same with everything else. Same with cryptocurrency.
Yes.
And everything else in the marketplace, and that's an important point to understand about the markets.
Let me ask you this, because I share your views, and people all sometimes criticize me and say, "Well, what about market failures? There's certain things markets can't solve," and they'll bring up. Usually, there's some. I've heard a lot of different examples, right? Like people talking about nuclear bombs in a backpack and other things. Like, do you subscribe to the notion of market failure?
No. First of all, government failure is always more severe. Nothing in the world is perfect.
Yeah.
And there's one of the rackets in the mainstream economics is something that we call the nirvana fallacy. They constructed this theory of competition that was called perfect competition. You took a college course in microeconomics, you'd heard of this.
Oh yeah.
And
related to perfect information.
It has all these totally unrealistic assumptions, perfect information. Everybody charges the exact same price and produces the exact same thing. Perfect. Okay. Any deviation from that is imperfect and is therefore a market failure. It's a straw man argument.
Oh, they called that a market failure.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. Or one of the arguments was that, since perfect information is one of the assumptions, you shouldn't need advertising, right? So the mere existence of advertising was said to be proof of market failure, and there also in the literature of economics, there's example after example after example of big shot mainstream economists calling something a market failure that turned out to be a hoax.
Yeah,
like I mentioned one, the QWERTY keyboard. QWERTY keyboard. There's this theory that the market competition locks in inferior technology. And there's an article in a prestigious journal that said there was another keyboard configuration called Dvorak, D-V-O-R-A-K. It was named after a guy of Czech origins, this guy Dvorak. Okay. And so anyways, there's an economist made the argument, there's yet another example of market failure. Well, two economists who are acquaintances of mine, free market economists, looked into this, and they found out that Mr. Dvorak was a naval officer in World War II, and he invented the Dvorak keyboard.
Yep.
And the studies proving that it was better than the QWERTY keyboard were done by Mr. Dvorak. That's like Chrysler claiming we've done studies and our cars are better than Toyotas. So that blew that out of the ground. And then another famous example is Paul Samuelson and all the Keynesians in their textbooks would use a lighthouse as an example of market failure because the light from a lighthouse produces a public good. That is, and it's impossible to get people to pay enough to supply an adequate supply of a public good that once it's there, how can you can't, what are you going to do, blow a ship out of the water? They can't take advantage of the light created by the lighthouse. It's impractical, okay? Therefore, the government needs to produce lighthouses. Well, Ronald Coase, who was another Nobel Prize-winning economist, also from Chicago, did what the Keynesians never do. He got up out of his office and went to the library. Can you believe that? A professor that gets up off his swivel chair and he researched lighthouses. He's British. Coase was British, although he spent his career here in the U.S. And he found out that for generations, there were private lighthouses all over Great Britain because the merchants were not so stupid as to think, oh, we're going to invest all this money shipping our goods all the way from America, and then a storm is going to come up and sink our boat, 100 yards from the harbor because they can't see the rocks. This is a good investment for us. So they did. And then the government eventually took them over, is what happened. And I'll give you one more example, is they claimed the proximity of beehives to apple orchards creates a market failure because, the bees give more honey if they're close to an apple orchard, and the apple orchard owner has more apples if the bees pollinate the apples. And so the theory was, well, there's not enough bees that are close to apple orchard. If we had more beehives by the apple orchard owners, there'd be both sides would benefit. So there's underproduction of honey and underproduction of apples. That's a market failure. And there's an economist in Washington State where they grow a lot of apples named Stephen Chung. He's a Chinese origin. And he did the same thing Coase did. He got up off a swivel chair in his office and researched the apple industry. And he found that, again, for generations, the beekeepers and the apple orchard owners had written contracts that the beekeepers would place the beehives at blossoming time near the apple orchards. And the apple orchard owners would, written in the contracts, things like, we will give you 2 weeks notice when we're going to spray pesticides on the apple trees, things like that. And so again, it's this market failure theory blown out of the water.
Wow.
But it's all based on this nirvana fallacy of this is what a perfect world looks like. And of course, everything is, beneath the perfect world, nirvana.
Yes.
And so that's the sort of the disreputable game that Keynesian economists and left-wing economists play.
Those are fantastic examples. Thank you. I've never heard of any of those. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. Okay, we're getting kind of close to time here. I wanted to just ask you quickly though. So you wrote a book, The Problems with Socialism.
Yes.
Maybe you could just, because it's gotten a little bit better now, I guess. But man, during the pandemic times, it seems like there was this big outcry for socialism. Again, people saying this is the problem, the late stage capitalism, all of this disaster we see around us, which of course is nonsense. But the young people were being mentally hijacked and driven towards socialism. So how do you debunk socialism for people?
Yeah, well, of course, people have been doing this for a long, long time. The story behind that book was my publisher at the time was Regnery Publishing, and they had read all these opinion polls of younger people, millennials at the time. They were called millennials. The opinion polls say 40 to 50% say they prefer socialism to capitalism, and Bernie Sanders was out there howling like a coyote about socialism. And the young kids are all attached to that because it's something promising something for nothing. Santa Claus,
right?
Government is Santa Claus. So Regnery, my editor there, calls me and says, "Would you be interested in writing a book that's sort of the size of the book would be the size that a high school student or a college student could put in a backpack, and written in plain English, making the case against socialism. And he said, but we need it in 5 weeks. And I said, yeah, I can do that. I do that in 5 weeks. So I did it. I was done in 4 weeks. And I just sat on it for a week to make him think I was hard at work for 5 weeks. Sent it to him.
How long of a book is it?
It's probably, I don't know, 9 or 10, 7 or 8 years ago. I forget the exact publication.
No, how long? How many pages or words is the book?
I'm not sure. I forget the word count, but it's. I'll send you one if you want me to give me an address. Email me an address. I don't know, it's about 200 pages, something like that.
In 4 weeks, man, you were fast worker.
Well, it's a topic I know a lot about.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's not like Mises' book Socialism or anything like that. I started out with Hayek's definition. Hayek said in the 1976 edition of The Road to Serfdom that socialism started out meaning government ownership of the means of production, the Soviet Union and all that. Yeah. But then it eventually, and because the purpose, the supposed purpose was egalitarianism, equality. Okay. And so, but that changed. And socialism today, by the 70s, it meant income redistribution through the welfare state and the income tax system primarily, and government ownership of whatever the government can take over. And I would have added regulation to that, but that's what so I said at the outset, that's what I'm going to take Hayek's definition as, not just government takeover of steel mills and things like that. And so I talk about the minimum wage. That's income redistribution. The welfare state in general, the government education, and in one of my classes I used to talk about this and say, well, what if we were to have some other industry? I'd say the pizza industry or something like that, or the food industry in general, where everybody pays a flat food tax every year. Everybody is assigned to a neighborhood grocery store. You can go to the grocery store and take home whatever you want, and you don't have to pay because you paid the food tax. And then whenever the vegetables would get rotten, the meat would be spoiled, well, the food tax will have to be increased so you can have fresh food. We don't want people to starve or anything like that. And we pay everybody the same so that, that's egalitarianism. We're gonna do. And if we ran the food industry like that, how efficient do you think it would be? And I'll never forget, one year I had this student from Taiwan in my class, and he immediately blurted out, "That's communism." And of course I said, well, what if you transpose the words public schools for food? Because that's how you're assigned to the neighborhood school, you pay the property tax, the teachers are all paid the same by seniority. So if you have normally in a private school, if you have too many gym teachers and too few math teachers applying, well, you need to pay the math teachers more, and you'll get more math teachers applying. But you can't do that because of the unions, the teachers' unions. And so you have a chronic shortage of math teachers, and you might even have the gym teacher trying to teach math. And I've heard stories like that. And so they get. So I have chapters like that in there about that level, not like the PhD level Ludwig von Mises and human action type writing.
Amazing. So, I always appreciated Hoppe's definition. I'm not sure if he originated it or lifted it from someone, but he said socialism is an institutionalized policy of aggression against private property.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That you're basically just legalizing plunder, right? As Bastiat might say.
That's plank number 1 in the Communist Manifesto, abolition of private property.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, what's central banking, number 5 or something like that?
Yeah, number 5. That's right, Which is interesting. So if you already abolished private property, I don't even understand why you need the central bank at that point.
Well, who doesn't want to be able to print money?
Yeah, well, exactly. Shit coining is an ever-present temptation. Okay, I really appreciate you coming for this conversation. This has been very insightful. Learned a lot. Really like those points on market failure. So thank you for that. You guys are doing a documentary, though.
Yes,
so
we have a documentary at the Mises Institute. It's called "Playing with Fire: Money, Banking, and the Federal Reserve." It's an attempt to educate the uneducated about what the Fed is, what it does, and why it's a threat to your life. And the playing with fire comes from James Grant. Ron Paul is in it. James Grant is in it. I'm in it. And a number of other Austrian economists are in it. Alex Pollock, who's become associated with us. He's a pretty well-known Washington figure in the conservative economic circles. But Jim Grant came up with the words for the title because he said the Fed is kind of like an arsonist who sets fires, and then once the fire gets going, he changes clothes into a firefighter's uniform and pretends to be putting out the fire by putting more gasoline on it. And that's basically what the Fed does. It prints money that creates boom and bust cycles. And then when the boom and bust cycle creates calamities like high unemployment and bankruptcies, it does more of the same, prints more money, like they did after the 2008 crash, after the COVID and everything. That's all the Fed knows how to do. That's what it does. It's counterfeiting. And so... And it's really comical when you think about it. And the chairman of the Fed is sort of like the Wizard of Oz. There's a whole book written by Robert Woodward, the famous Watergate author, who was a CIA guy, by the way, in reality, naval intelligence rather. He was naval intelligence, and all of a sudden got a job at the Washington Post. He wrote a whole book called The Maestro about Greenspan. So he's like a maestro guiding the economy is like an orchestra, and Greenspan was a maestro. But no one would call the Fed chairman a maestro today. But our documentary is aimed at teaching the average person who knows little or nothing about it what the Fed is about, and hopefully getting them to learn even more about it. When Ron Paul was interviewed by Tucker Carlson not too long ago, Tucker Carlson told him, when I saw that you were at Michigan State University and the students started spontaneously chanting, "End the Fed, end the Fed," he said, "Here I am. I'm a professional journalist. I was being paid to know things like this." And Tucker Carlson said, "And I knew nothing at all about the Fed at the time. So if he knew nothing about it,
crazy.
The average American knows nothing about it, and that's on purpose. The Fed doesn't want you to know what they're up to, but we can't get people behind ending the Fed and introducing competition in currency until they at least understand something about it.
Sure.
And that's the purpose of this. It's on our website, Mises.org/fire, or it's on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm glad that people are hopefully becoming more aware, because I know when I read The Creature from Jekyll Island almost 20 years ago, when I was pounding the pavement about fiat currency and central banking, people were just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But it does seem like it's, maybe I'm just hanging out in the echo chamber too much, but it does seem like generalized knowledge of central banking is getting out there.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing.
We're doing our part. I have an autographed copy of The Creature of Jekyll Island that was autographed in person by the author on Jekyll Island.
That's awesome.
The Mises Institute had a conference at the Jekyll Island Club, and he was attending a conference at the convention center nearby, but staying at the same hotel. And so
that's awesome.
And we had copies of his book for sale there, and so
that's awesome. I was fortunate to have G. Edward Griffin on the show, and then I actually gave a talk in the Jekyll Island Club room as well, where they had the meeting of the six men just last November.
Oh yeah,
and it's a very quaint looking room for a place that such an evil scheme was hatched.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, when I was in that room, I swear the eyeballs were moving when I walked through it. Those big pictures of the founders of the Fed.
Oh, man.
Senator Aldrich and all these characters.
Yeah, they definitely look like cartoonish supervillains for sure.
J.P. Morgan told people it was a duck hunt.
Yeah.
They were there for a duck hunt.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for doing this. Tom, if you have any parting words of wisdom, please feel free to share them, and then let people know where they can find you on the internet.
Okay, well, check out our website, Mises.org. I'm also a columnist on LewRockwell.com. That's L-E-W, a man's name, LewRockwell.com. I have hundreds of articles over the years I've published there. Or you can check out my Amazon page. I'm the author or co-author of 18 books, and you can see some of them anyway on my Amazon page.
Fantastic. So, Tom, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.